I want to thank, of course, Roshi for once again hosting us, to Noah for all the work, Bonnie, the residents, everything that you're contributing. Important for us to remember that these programs are those of us in person have made already some offering for what we're receiving, but it's important to remember that this is mostly just supported through donation, through what we call dana in Sanskrit, right? The act of giving, the first perfection of the Bodhisattva's perfections. So I just want to encourage everyone, both online and in person, to keep that in mind, that we are together building this world, making this world together, and part of that is also sharing our resources together, those of us that can. I also want to now turn to Amy Varela and Gabor Karshai of Mind and Life Europe. Amy and Gabor, I'm hoping you're there online. And if you'd like to say just a couple of words, just a couple of opening words, you'd be most welcome to do so. Are you there? I see Amy. Amy, why don't you go first?
I can't unmute myself. I can unmute myself now. Hi, John. Thank you so much for that little introduction. And I wanted to just say hello to everyone who's there, present at Upaya. I regret not being able to be with you, but here I am in Paris, and in Europe, along with a number of our participants. So I'm very happy to welcome everyone on the cloud, in the cloud, in the clouds, and embodied and embedded in Upaya to this event, and to say that I'm very, very grateful to Upaya and to Roshi Joan for holding us all and bringing us together in this experience. I think I could say would be an experience of participatory sense making together, as a little preview to Laura's talk a little bit later. So thank you very much for inviting us, and thank you very much for all of you for being there. And on behalf of Mind and Life Europe, I think Gabor Karsai is somewhere in the cloud there.
Gabor, are you there? Perhaps Gabor is not. Did he raise his digital? Can you raise your digital hand? All right, we will find you. Nora will find you. Raise your hand, Gabor, your digital hand. Or just say something, Gabor. Are we finding you? Perhaps you're not online. Just say something if you're online. And if not, then we'll find another opportunity. There will definitely be another opportunity, so maybe we'll just move on. So, yes. Okay, sure, let me do that for both of these devices. I just have this as a clock primarily. Okay, actually, can you just put that in a place I'll see it? Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Okay, are we good? Perfect. Gabor. Raising hand. Gabor, can you unmute yourself and just say something? You're muted, Gabor. Yeah, there we go.
No, yes. I'm unmuted. Yeah, I've been talking and tried to raise my hand.
There's some metaphor there. I'm not sure what it is, but
no, that's fine. Thank you. I just I would like to envision the audience and the community there at Upaya. It would be wonderful to hear how many of you are there. Welcome you all over there and here in the online space as well. It's a real privilege for us at Mind and Life Europe to be part of this collaboration with Upaya Zen Center and Roshi Joan Halifax, and with you all who are here today, following and walking in the footsteps of Francisco Varela and remembering him, celebrating his legacy with the name of this event, Varela International Symposium. And I don't want to talk too much because Amy has so beautifully shared our goodwill and best intention here. I just want to raise a question for the whole gathering, for the whole meeting and the discussions here. We are sentient beings with senses, sensing a reality and trying to make sense of it. And by that, making a world that feels ours, feels belonging to us. But can we make a world that is not only ours, in which other sentient beings can participate too, a world that is sensed, made, and lived together? I hope we are going to explore that these 2 days. Thank you all.
Thank you, Gabor. And as Gabor said, we are here, right? So we're talking about, we have this name in the title, the Varela International Symposium, honoring Francisco Varela, or recalling his influence. I only spoke to him, I think, a couple of times on the phone when I was working on a book, Sleeping, Dreaming, Dying, that Roshi is actually part of many years ago. But I had a couple of great conversations. And certainly what Francisco Varela worked on, along with his colleagues, has been very inspirational. And part of that, you've heard this term perhaps, this idea of inaction. And we'll hear some others talk about it, but let me just give you a very brief, one easy way for someone like me, an amateur, to think about inaction, is to think about it in terms of this idea of sense making. And a very simple example, which also shows you how profound, in a way, quite literally almost, this idea is to consider something like some kind of even a single-celled organism, a very simple organism. And it is embedded in an environment. And let's say in that environment, there's a substance that is noxious to it, that will harm it. There's the bad stuff. And then there's something that it actually can use to energize it, as energy, like let's say maybe a glucose gradient or something. More and more, you go up the glucose gradient, there's more and more, or you go up the gradient of the bad stuff, and there's more and more. So what does this organism do? It makes sense of its world through interactions, not just kind of objectively, not just sitting back and watching, but through engagement, through action. So that those very categories, you could say kind of the good stuff and the bad stuff, are themselves being created by that organism enacting itself in the world, enacting a world with itself, so that self and world are mutually being constituted. So another organism, glucose may be irrelevant. It doesn't even cognize it, right? It doesn't even have a way of being aware of it. And the noxious substance might be yummy. That might be the good stuff, right? So it will organize its reality in a completely different way. So part of what that means is those categories themselves are not given with the stuff, right? That the categories are being constructed as the organism is making its way in the world, which is basically, and how is it making its way in the world? And this is the key, because there's going to be a kind of Buddhist parallel here, is that the organism is making its way in the world to survive, right? And to reproduce. So that's, you could say a kind of baseline might be sort of survival and reproduction. And survival is through getting the good stuff, which may often involve some kind of a reward signal, like, oh, that feels good. And then avoiding the bad stuff, which is facilitated by learning from the pain of encountering the bad stuff. So we basically have pleasure and pain as kind of signals that are telling us, this is going to allow us to survive. This is the thing that's not going to allow us to survive. This is going to allow us to reproduce. This is the thing that's not. And so we are organisms are constructing their environments in this way. So this is a very simple way of talking about an action, right? At a very, very simple level. But there is an intuition that we also have in the Buddhist context about concept formation, about the categories that we use in the world. And here I'm going to refer to one of my favorite Buddhist philosophers, Dharmakirti, a 7th century philosopher who wrote in Sanskrit. And Dharmakirti is really adopting something that's quite clear even earlier in Buddhism. He's just clarifying it, which is basically the idea that, and here we can even go back to the philosophers so important in the Zen tradition as well, Nagarjuna, from around the 1st century, one of the earliest philosophers in what we call Mahayana Buddhism, and this insight into emptiness. And there are different ways of thinking about emptiness. I'm going to be a little creative and talk about a slightly different way, a somewhat non-traditional way of talking about emptiness of categories themselves, like emptiness of a categorical identity. And here's the basic idea. One intuition we might have is that, you know, shall we call these mugs? You know, I came back to Upaya, I had to do the mug thing, right? So,
talk slower.
Okay, the interpreters, yes. Well, they can listen to the recording and interpret later. No, I'm sorry. I didn't. Lo siento. No es verdad. Voy a hablar únicamente en español. No. So these are both what we can call mugs, if we like. Are we good with that category of mug? And everyone agree with that? Okay. So this is a mug and this is a mug. Are they the same? Who votes? You want to say they're the same, really? This one is a little bit different height, slightly different color, and also this has some writing on it that this one doesn't have. So they're not exactly the same. So they're different, right? Just like this is different from this, this is different from this, right? Are we agreeing with that? There are. Adam so helpfully says they're platonically the same. So we can look at every detail of these cups, and we could go down to the micro level, and we will not find anything that is exactly identical about them, will we? Physically, right? They're slightly different shapes. The stuff they're made out of is slightly different. So the Platonic answer to this, which is also an answer we find in many Indian philosophical traditions that Buddhists are critiquing, is that there's nothing physical that's the same about them. There's a kind of cupness, right? That's the same, which is not a physical thing, right? This is why we call this Platonic. There's a kind of essence that's not a physical essence. In modern terms, we might actually go from, that's called an intention. In technical philosophical terms, we could go to an extension. We might say there's a set, there's an entity that's a set, which is also not a physical thing, right? And they belong to the same set. But in any case, these things as particular entities are themselves distinct. And the Buddhist claim would be, and I think we could probably easily support that, is that they're entirely distinct. There's literally nothing about them that's exactly identical in their physical makeup. But we say, oh, they're both cups. And the way we do that, from the Buddhist perspective, is not that there's some kind of a floating cupness. Because just imagine there is a floating cupness, Adam's cupness, up here. Now we can just ask, okay, so there's cupness, and right, then one version of the Platonic approach is that actually the real cup is the cupness, this abstract entity. And these are the kind of pale reflections, you know, in Plato's cave. These are the pale reflections of the real thing, right? So we can just ask this very simple question, right? There's the cupness and then these individuals, okay? And I just ask you, are they the same or different than the cupness? Any volunteers? Everyone's afraid. What's he gonna do? Both things are true. They're both the same and different. That's exactly what I told the cop when I went through the light. It was both red and not red. And the engineer building my plane that I flew in, hopefully did not think that this both is and is not an aileron. Probably we don't want to, so we can, even in practical kind of ordinary terms, we maybe do that. But when we're trying to say, what is it really? Then we try to play by the rules of what's called non-deviant logic. So we don't accept that something can be both X and not X simultaneously. And we also don't accept that it can be neither X nor not X, if those two are exhaustive categories, what are called contradictories. It's got to be one of them. So either the cupness is the same or it's different. Can't be both, can't be neither. All right? Like when the people are building our planes, we probably prefer them to have that attitude about measurements and things, right? It both is and isn't 1 centimeter long. There was that famous example of some probe, I forget what it was, where they actually switched metric and imperial measurements and it crashed. Do you remember that? It was a few years ago. The Mars probe, yeah. So like it counts, you know?
What if they're just light reflections on my retina?
They're what?
Light reflections on my retina.
There are light reflections on your retina. Can you hold water in a light reflection on your retina?
I can see the water.
Yes. So so a cup is a light reflection on your retina?
Water that gets reflected on.
Yeah. This is actually a nice direction, but I'm asking a different question, which is the cupness the same or different than the cups?
The same.
The cupness is the same. Okay, so it's the same as this cup? And it's this, that's fine. And then it's the same as this cup? Or mug? Actually, it's mug, right? The same as this mug and the same as this mug, right? So they are the same. No, wait. I thought are they the same or different?
They're the same.
They're the same. So why am I holding two things then?
Well, they both have the platonic cupness.
I see. So wouldn't it by transitivity, if this is the same as cupness and this is the same as cupness, then these two should also be identical, right? No, not they. I'm asking whether they're the same or different than cupness.
They're both the same as cupness.
They're both the same. So then they're actually one thing. They're not two things. So then we have a problem of relations, right? So you're saying cupness is related to this, but it's not related to this, right? So there's like an entity cupness, and then there's a relation between the cupness and this thing, right? Is the relation the same as this or different? If the relation is same as this, then we're back to the original problem. If the relation is different in it, then we need another relation to tie the relation to the relation. It's called an infinite regress. Now, I realize we've gotten very complicated, and lo siento para los traductores. And there's much more we could say about this. But the basic insight here is that from the Buddhist standpoint, and there's a whole, kind of series of arguments we can use, not just this one, is that the category of cup does not exist in the world as a real entity. No categories exist in the world as real entities. We are, in a way that is similar to the inactive perspective, we are constructing those categories. And why are we constructing those categories? We're constructing them for the same reason, as Dharmakirti says, hey upadeya. We're not doing it just out of a bad habit. We're actually interested in something. We want to get the good stuff and we want to avoid the bad stuff. We want to be good samsara survivors, right? We don't want pain, we want pleasure, which are also signals for survival and reproduction. Like that's what we want. And so we organize our world around categories that are constructed in that way. Right? Higher level categories get more complicated, but the claim is that they all come back down to this basic kind of mode of concept formation, which is there's the good stuff, that's not the bad stuff. And how do we create these categories? We know these are different, but from our standpoint, in terms of what we want to do, they both accomplish what we want, like hold water for us to drink. So we ignore their difference and we create a sameness for them. We superimpose a sameness onto these entities. They're actually completely unique. totally unique. There's nothing about them that's the same. But we think they're the same, right? We do that, of course, with all kinds of things, especially, in social context. With people, we do that. Oh, he's a so-and-so, she's a such and such, and I'm a, well, never mind. But, right, and we're going to come back to social categories soon. So this is, Noah got this for me a little while ago. This is not a mug. This is not a mug. This is empty of being a mug. It doesn't have that Platonic essence, according to this perspective. So there's no objective reality that makes it a mug. What makes it a mug is the way we are interpreting it for our purposes. And of course, if it were completely irrelevant, we just wouldn't even have a category for it, because we wouldn't pay any attention to it. Right? We wouldn't even see it. Just like Dan Goleman, I've never tracked down this study, but Dan Goleman once told me, like, there was some study that said when they studied famous people in parties, basically, and the higher up the hierarchy you were, the fewer people you thought were at the party, because you just literally didn't see them. It's like, well, they're not important. They're not bad for me. They're not good for me. So they're just not there. Right? I don't know if that's true or not, but someone should do that study if it hasn't been done. So that is the critique, you can say, of this kind of objective notion of there being some kind of objective categories. Now, when we get there, like if you have that as an experience, that could be a little anxiety producing. Because we can think that our categories in the world are like, solid things. We're not making this stuff up. This is the reality. And when we have a sense that the cups are empty of really being cups, people are empty of really being people, that can start to feel like, I don't know what's going on. And there is another parallel here that's interesting is, of course, what this means is that concepts are mostly about prediction, according to Buddhists, which is then aligns with like the idea of predictive processing, a bit of a fad in neuroscience, but probably a lot of that makes sense, that basically the brain is like predicting, constantly predicting. And one way to understand anxiety is when those predictions just seem to constantly fail. The world becomes precarious. We can no longer predict what's going to happen. And the failure of prediction can feel like, oh, something's wrong. Now, the Buddhist perspective is that it was always wrong, right? That the predictions work to a certain degree, but they project all kinds of false identities onto things. They assume, for example, not only that cups are really cups, but even the experience of pleasure is really pleasure, right? So that kind of prediction, which seems so solid to us, and which is how we work, both from a Buddhist perspective and perhaps from a contemporary psychological perspective, the Buddhists are saying that's always been false. It's not like something's being taken away. So one way of thinking about precarity in the Buddhist world is about that, is that prediction. But interestingly, there's also, one of the things that is a starting point for precarity, a kind of entryway into precarity, is the precarity of our human existence itself, which is to say we're going to die, right? Birth as a human is a fatal state. And there's actually no doubt we're going to die. This is not, right? So we're kind of starting out with learning to engage with precarity from a Buddhist standpoint of traditional meditations on death by being certain about something. But then these meditations move up very quickly into uncertainty. For example, when are you going to die? One phrase is, you don't know which is going to come next, your next breath or your next life. At a certain age, it starts to sound a little more realistic. Right? Roshi told me a story of someone who actually literally died in the middle of a session. Just boom. They thought he was doing great meditation. Yeah, no, really. I'll let her share that later if she wants. Right? You don't know what's going to come to you. Go to sleep. Are you going to wake up dead? That doesn't make sense, does it? But, right? The stuff that makes you live is the stuff that can kill you. You eat the wrong stuff, it kills you. Like the Buddha died of food poisoning. So that is like now introducing us to this notion of uncertainty, of being ready for a kind of tolerance of the uncertain. Tolerance for the inconceivability of reality. That it extends beyond our concepts and our categories. So that sense of the uncertainty of our reality itself becomes a main Buddhist practice, a key Buddhist practice. And this also points to, like in Zen practice, the idea of the great doubt, right? Where we sort of see through the simplistic reality that we projected on the world, and suddenly things seem to fall apart. Cups aren't cups, people aren't people. Pleasure isn't pleasure. And that doubt is actually not something that we as organisms usually try to resist. We are not comfortable, because if we're in doubt, if we're uncertain, we may not survive. But it's exactly embracing that uncertainty, that precarity, that is so key to, in a sense, no longer being just subject to the various categorizations and the stories that we tell, to changing, to radical transformation. Now, I mentioned stories, and I know that Molly is going to say a fair bit of this about this later. But I want to turn now to a certain way of thinking about what's happening to us now, right? The certain kind of precarity that we face. And the place I want to begin is just an idea of humans. It's maybe some intuitions about this in Buddhism, but this is something I've really learned from other sources. The idea that part of what it really means to be a human is to be a cooperator, right? That we are. The reason we have flourished on this planet, despite all of our problems, the reason that we can build places like this, or Roshi's new amazing building, is I promise you, Roshi's not out there herself, like digging and nailing, and maybe sometimes, but that it's a whole group of people. It's not even just the workers. It's the people who do the design, the people who provide the funds, the people who feed the workers, the farmers who farm the food that the workers have, the truck drivers who drive the food. It's a whole vast network of cooperation. And that vast network of cooperation is what empowers us as humans. And one way of thinking about what enables us to cooperate is actually that we kind of connect to other humans. But we generally do that in a very biased way, in what's called our in-group, right? So we form a kind of connection with others that, in a sense, are on our team. And part of what enables us to do that is actually a certain kind of cognitive capacity. Now, I've gotten some of this from Michael Tomasello. There are others who speak of similar things. And I've also tweaked it in a certain Buddhist way, and you have an essay online that I wrote about this. So Tomasello's idea is that, you can see what's called theory of mind, basically attributing intentional states, emotional states to some other agent. You can even see that in our closest relatives, the chimpanzees. But his claim is that we have something, he would call that joint intentionality. Like you can chimpanzees can kind of have a dyadic kind of relationship of this kind of attributing mental states to each other, emotional states. But humans have shared intentionality. we can do something all together, multiple of us. Like a simple example is, sports. When you have a bunch of people on the field, it's not like they're all looking at each other. Oh, you're doing this, and, okay. And there's a sense of a whole, of keeping an entire group in mind, the intentionality of an entire group with very distinct roles that are even interchangeable. So apparently the way chimpanzees hunt is kind of the way 5-year-olds play soccer, which is like everyone kind of runs, like there's not a lot of kind of, complex collaboration. People don't have different positions. They're just all me getting that instead of us working together. And part of what that means is that as we're us working together, we have to have a capacity not only to sort of be aware of all of us without objectifying each other, without being dyadic, a kind of awareness that is a non-objectified awareness of the group, so to speak. And at the same time, we also need, in a way of predicting. Like, what's going to happen next? What are the rules we're playing by? So the construction of these kinds of human groups depends, and by the way, you can think of this even in simple terms of mental time travel, just as an individual. Like if you think about, okay, we're going to end here, and then I'm going to go do this and that, and then I'm going to eat lunch. There's almost a certain, for humans at least, a kind of narrative structure, even just in doing that, like thinking about what you're going to do in the future. There's a you're going to have a set of predictions, and there are rules that run those predictions, right? It's not like your prediction includes, oh, suddenly the ground is going to open up, and a black hole is going to, maybe atoms, but the rest of us, we don't, it just doesn't, that's not how it works, right? When you are dealing with a group of humans, that kind of narrativity becomes even more important. The capacity, in a sense, to be together in a group, to engage in activities together, which involves a lot of prediction, a lot of rule following of norms, right? That capacity depends very heavily on a kind of narrativity that Molly's going to talk about. And I think Melissa, to some extent, too. And that narrative, so one way of thinking about that narrativity is it involves, so there's stories, but the stories are running by rules that can exist in a universe of competing stories. Right? So this is what we call sometimes a meta-narrative, or another way of talking about this is talking about a narrative universe. And they run these universes that run by rules. The meta-narrative really is talking about the stock characters and the rules of the universe. So for example, like if you ever do role-playing games or live role-playing, there are people who do LARPing, as they call it, live role-playing, and they dress up, So if you're in the Tolkien universe, you dress up as an orc or an elf, or a hobbit, and you kind of act out some stories. And there's an infinite number of stories you can act out. Infinite. But they run by rules. Like hobbits have hairy feet. No, really, they do. They have hairy feet. If you show up without hairy feet, you're like, God, dude, what are you doing? You're ruining it. Right? There are rings of power. There aren't like mugs of power. There are rings of power. Right? If you play, you're going to do this in the Star Wars universe, then there are Jedi Knights and midichlorians, and there are Sith Lords, and there's the good and the bad, the light, the dark side, and blah, 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 the light side. And then, if you're Star Trek, it's like, there's Heisenberg capacitors. Anyone know? Adam knows. No one else knows what that is. But that, and then there's transporters and warp drive. And these run by rules, and it's really hard. Like if you start to break the rules, like if you say, okay, Frodo picked up his cell phone to call Luke see if he knew where Spark was because he'd lost his lightsaber. Like, what world am I in now? So part of the idea here in transformation is that we are stuck in a narrative universe. Not even just a story. Like we're stuck in a narrative universe that we think is real. Except, right, as Jean-François Lyotard pointed out, like in 1979, I mean, many people critique his book, Les Conditions Postmodernes, I think it's called. But but it's really quite insightful. Part of what we're seeing now is we all kind of know that the stories aren't real. Like there's a fight to try to make our different stories real, often just within the same narrative universe. Some of this is about the objectification of knowledge in the modern period. One might argue that in other contexts, other kinds of cultures, even now, the ability to tell a story and to ask the question, is it true or false, or is it real or unreal? It's like that doesn't even make sense to ask that question. So part of our evolution is learning to, first of all, see the story as empty of reality. Even the universe in which the story is running, the norms, the rules of the universe, we made them. And there is no objective universe past the story. That's a key part of this insight. Because, of course, all the categories that we make to create an objective universe are part of the story, are coming out of that same cognitive system. That doesn't mean there aren't constraints. We know there are constraints. But our model of the world, which is often a predictive model of the world, is not the world. And even the idea of there's world and self, it is already a model. So we've come to the point, I think, a kind of evolutionary inflection point of precarity, where we need to embrace the precarity and not think we're going to find the one true story, the modern project, universalizing the one true story that we're all going to embrace as somehow the truth. That's not it. I'm not saying this is going to be easy to do that. But I'll end by reflecting on how there is a kind of very concrete way in which we do this in Buddhist practice. So now I think it happens in Zen, but there's also in Tibetan practice, part of the way this is done is through tantric practice, especially ritualized tantric practice, where you begin by dissolving the universe, which of course means the stories, and the narrative universe in which all those stories are being told, including oneself, all dissolves into emptiness. Om Sarva Dharmaha Sabhava Shuddhaha Sabhava Shuddhoham. All things are by nature pure of some kind of fixed identity. They're devoid of a fixed identity. I too am devoid, I'm purified of a fixed identity. Like it makes you pure to let go of being some essentialized person. It makes reality pure to let go of its essence. And then from within emptiness, the new reality arises. The reality of the mandala in the Tibetan context, right? In which all the world arises transformed, and all the beings arise as deities. And yet, the practice here is as you arise as a deity, you are made of light. Because what this is meant to induce is the experience of appearing yet empty. Appearing yet not real. Because there is nothing real in the way our cognitive system tells us there is. That kind of reality just isn't there. Right? Appearing but empty, empty but appearing. And so the ability, in some sense, to retell the story, to transform the world, to change the narratives, to change the narrative universe in which we are caught, which Molly will say more about, to change it requires also letting go, even of our most cherished reality. My mother used to have, Anna might remember this, but she used to have a pot. She had these nice little kind of clay pots in the kitchen with different titles, you know, like dill. And one of them was Cherished Illusions. It was empty, but not really, right? So, and here I think one of the most challenging things, and you find this in Buddhist texts, and you also see this in some empirical philosophy, by Sean, I'm forgetting his name. Whoops. Not Sean Gallagher, no. Anyway, I'll come up with it later. But in any case, there's some evidence that if you say to somebody, oh, you know, what if you lost your ear? Would you still be yourself? Yeah, if I lost a toe, yeah, you know, if I lost a leg, if I change everything, you know, if I change gender, yeah, it's still me. If you say, if you totally change your moral position, they go, no. John Nichols, thank you. Yes, yeah. Yes, Sean Nichols. And he's got some collaborators, I can't remember, but yes, thank you. Yes, yes. Yeah, really cool stuff. Nina Strominger, right? Yes, yeah, I was part of that. The John Templeton Foundation funded some of that research, and I was involved a little bit. But so, you know, that idea, like, oh, the most important categories I have are moral categories. And when you see out there right now, like the fights about which narrative is going to win, or even which narrative universe is going to win, a lot of it is moralized. And fighting morality with more morality is not going to work. Right? That's just playing the same game, that's telling the same stories. That may not be a very popular idea, so I guess I'll just be off on the mountain telling my own story to myself, all alone. But that's, I think, the challenge. The biggest challenge is to let go of what we most cherish so that we can reconfigure, because we do need to, I think. I'm going to leave it at that. We started a little late. I'm going to ask Richie for a few minutes of reflection, and then we'll see if there's some time maybe for a question or two. Maybe we'll start with the next talk a little bit after 11. So thank you very much. Richie, you want to come up? So while Richie's getting ready, I'll just say Laura Candioto is going to be our next speaker. And well, we'll start right around 11. Laura, I assume you're probably online there somewhere. Okay, sounds good. So Laura, we'll start at 11:10. All right, take it away.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful. I want to comment on a couple of things. One is just to point out that the perspective that John shared is actually one that is really resonant with modern neuroscience these days. And so the idea that the world is essentially devoid of intrinsic categories, that these categories are ones that we create in the process of sense making, is something that is very much resonant with how we understand the brain's construction of reality. And so this is one of the really important points of interaction and convergence between neuroscience and Buddhism. And I think it's one that has been highly productive and continues to be in exploring this interaction. When John says that no categories exist in the world as real entities, one question I have is Buddha nature a category? And
And does it exist ultimately?
does it exist ultimately? Yes.
Depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
I'll
And
answer
so,
later.
and so one of the things that I would like to put on the table is that there may be, and I don't know if we want to call it a category, but there are qualities that I think are part of the human repertoire, and I would consider Buddha nature to be part of that. Whether we want to call them categories or not is irrelevant, but that they are part of the nature of our mind, and that one of the essential components of practice is discovering what is in fact the nature of our mind, and coming to understand the presence of those qualities and nurturing those qualities, I think, is something important. And so, that's just putting something on the table for future discussion.
Can I say one thing to that, Richie?
Please.
So I actually really appreciate that, and there's going to be a range of answers. But one way of saying it is, as a concept, it's a category.
No.
But is it a category that captures something especially useful? And here's one way of thinking about what's especially useful about it. There's a kind of connectivity we have with humans that's dependent upon that narrative, but that's built on another fundamental capacity, which is sort of below that, which you could say is the capacity just to connect, which is one way of understanding what's called selva or prakasha, like luminosity. Like the mind is empty of any kind of fixed nature, but it's got this fundamental connectivity. And in humans, what that means is this fundamental capacity that we see across humans to not just connect, but also to care.
Yes,
right?
And that may be the kind of underlying substrate of the cooperation that you talked about.
Right, exactly. Without that, if there isn't this kind of spontaneous kind of, caring for in-group, I mean, it's biased, but there isn't that kind of.
It's not biased at certain points in life.
Right.
It becomes biased through learning.
I will not contest that at the moment.
Yeah, children before the age of 3 do not make any discrimination based on the color of their skin, as one example. So the other thing I wanted to comment on is you said something like we're stuck in a narrative universe that we think is real. And I think you put it really beautifully. And one of the important elements of practice, which you also alluded to, is not so much changing the narrative, but changing our relationship to the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really what certain elements of practice are designed to do. And this is something important to recognize because it stands in contrast to a lot of approaches in modern psychology, which basically try to change the narrative rather than starting with changing our relationship to the narrative. And it may be that the narrative becomes much more flexible once our relationship to the narrative is changed. And so I think this is a really important point and one that distinguishes a Buddhist approach from most contemporary psychology.
Yeah, excellent point.
So I'll end there and just appreciate all you're doing. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Richie. Thank you so much. I know Richie could say more, but while Richie's up here, we could take, I think, maybe 5 minutes to.
I think maybe that'd be great to take one question from our community.
Yeah.
One from
Online? Okay. Yes. So if there's a question, anyone have question, comment? Here's a question here. And then one from online.
Thank you. Can you hear okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Good. So you mentioned about when you were speaking about seeing the story as empty, that that the categories don't exist, but constraints do. So I wondered where the constraints exist or how constraints, what is that?
So what we observe, so the categories do exist. in our minds, right? So it's not that the categories don't exist. They do exist in our minds. In our experience, the categories exist. They just don't exist as real things in the world. Yeah. And when we say there are constraints, what that means is that we have, in our shared experience, we construct some categories that are constrained by our intersubjective experience. So if I say, you know, oh, this is an apple, right? You say, someone else want to vote apple? No one's voting apple. Okay. Now, you know, that doesn't mean that cup, mug is like what it is really. It just means that for us as a community, as a kind of epistemic community, we share certain constraints because of who we are, including because of the stories we tell, that make it such that, you know, there's a limit, there's literally an infinite number of ways to categorize this, but it's limited by those intersubjective constraints. When you move into certain other kinds of categories, especially ones that involve narrativity and narrative universes, you can have fewer and fewer constraints. And therefore, it takes, in a way, the constraints kind of reassure us, right? It's like, oh, it's not an apple. Thank God, I thought it really, like he sees an apple, holy smokes, you know, what's going on? But, so because there's something that is like in our sensory experience that we report to each other, which seems to be a constraint. I mean, it's kind of reassuring. But then as there's less and less sensory constraint, we have to work harder and harder and harder to maintain the reality of other kinds of categories. And a really good example of this is in the context of conspiracy theories, where, you know, the best conspiracy theories are the ones that are completely unmoored by any kind of intersubjective sensory experience. You can't actually point to anything sensory to contradict it, because it can always be explained at some higher level where it's not constrained. But it takes a lot of work and a lot of, you know, people who've done, I think Molly, I'm sure, must know quite a lot about this, that like in those contexts, it takes a lot of work, like social connectivity, to maintain the truth of those categories, because you don't have sort of intersubjective shared sensory experience. And that's part of why they become very dangerous, you know, because now, in a sense, everything is permitted as long as you keep the story the same. And there are various kinds of entities that operate that way. You know, lots of social entities. Social realities are very powerful. Like if I wish I had some money, I know I'm going on a little bit, but let me just say this real quick. It's like a really good example of a social reality that has a tremendous impact, but it's just completely made up, is money. Right? And my favorite, I gave my son Jake a 1,000 rupee note recently for his birthday. It was not worth anything, because the Indian government a couple of years ago suddenly declared that because people were hoarding them to avoid paying taxes, all 1,000 rupee notes are no longer worth anything. So one day you could go buy, you know, some atta or whatever, and go buy some flour, and the next day you can't do anything with it. Nothing's changed about this thing. Just the social conventions have changed. If all humans suddenly were transported to a different dimension or whatever, and just all the money was left here, it's not like the aliens would come and say, oh, look, $1,000. And, you know, it becomes even more kind of dramatic when you think about it in terms of how banking works now, where it's all just like a digital number. I don't even have cash. Right? So that's a profound, it's real, it does things, but it's completely socially fabricated. Right? And so there are lots of things that operate that way, especially, you know, identities, gender identities, right? That are operating in this way. And they're real to us, but they're completely socially constructed. Anyway, so those are things that are often not constrained. And therefore, they take a lot of work to maintain. Okay. Constrain me, yeah.
If you can, you had a comment you wanted to make? Sorry, no. So it's important that we keep relatively to the constraints of the schedule. So, and also take care of our bodies. So we're going to have a 10-minute break and then reconvene at 11:10 Mountain Time. That's actually an 8-minute break.
8-minute
So
break.
take
Thank
care of your
you.
body. Thank you. Wonderful, John. Thank you, Richie.